The government did nothing to question where the money came from, or even whether it was legally his. They accepted the guarantees of an eminent merchant bank, Clermont Benson. The bank also had no idea where the money came from. They accepted Fayed's assurances that it was legally his money, and in turn, they received a huge fee.
I think Fayed was dishonest, and he succeeded in making those elements in the establishment permit themselves to be used as tools through greed and lack of scrupulousness. I think it showed that here is this outsider who should have had every disadvantage, was able by the manipulation of monetary forces to get to the very top, helped and aided by senior city firms who should never have done anything of the kind.
Tiny Rowland now swore revenge. He was furious that Fayed had got the very thing that he wanted. He saw it as evidence that the Thatcher government was now at the mercy of the forces they had unleashed, the powerful global markets and a corrupt city of London who would do anything for money. He wrote Thatcher a letter accusing her of corruption and announced publicly in the Times, "I will not go away. You will see me in your dreams. You will need to take 2 Mogadon rather than 1 to get to sleep at night." In June 1987, Mrs. Thatcher was triumphantly re-elected for a 3rd term. But almost immediately, Britain was hit by an economic crisis that was to turn yet another ageing tycoon against her.
Good evening. It is a day that will be in bold print in history books. Black Monday, October 19th, 1987, when the stock market went into a free fall.
The crisis began in New York. A wave of panic swept through the stock market that shares, which had risen continuously for the past 4 years, were overvalued. A contagion of fear infected the world's markets. The next morning, when the London Stock Exchange opened, it immediately fell by 20%.
The sense on the floor, on our trading floor, it was doom and gloom. It's the end of the world. That was the big phrase. The end of the world, mate. This is it. Blood on the street. It was total sense of helplessness. There's nothing anyone could do. You can't control billions and billions of dollars worth of money. If the markets think the market is going to go down, it will go down. Governments are absolutely powerless.
Governments watched helplessly as the crisis rolled around the world. One after another, stock markets crashed. To many, it seemed as if governments, like Mrs. Thatcher's, had, through deregulation, created a force that was now overwhelming them. One of those who now became frightened was James Goldsmith. Since the crisis of the 70s, he had lived in America. He had made a fortune, asset-stripping corporations and manipulating the markets. But now he decided that the very thing that had made him rich had become a threat to world stability.
I think our financial system is extremely fragile. I think that you can see it in the way the volatility of currencies. You can see all sorts of weaknesses. I believe that the politicians, unthinkingly, have created a situation, a structure, whereby our financial system is dangerous and could create great problems for the real economy.
Goldsmith now gave up business and retreated to the remote Mexican jungle. He used his fortune to begin building a vast private estate. He specifically designed it to be a self-sufficient community. It would be a world under his control.
Mexico was his dream, but like other dreams, there's also a reality that often conflicts with the dream, and things happen that weren't supposed to happen. Sometimes the bottling plant for the water got contaminated, or sharks got into his private beach and had to be chased away with dynamite, or the mosquitoes couldn't be controlled ecologically by being eaten by birds, so they had to use DDT. That's not what he wanted. What he wanted was a a perfect biosphere where everything lived together in harmony. It was the golden age, going back to a time in history where we didn't have all the problems.
Goldsmith's estate was dominated by an enormous domed palace on a cliff above the ocean. Around it were houses for his wife, his past wives, and his mistress. The estate was guarded by an army of ex-SAS soldiers. They were organised by Colonel David Stirling, Goldsmith's friend from his time in Mayfair in the 60s. Goldsmith's views became more and more apocalyptic. He began to see everything, from AIDS to mad cow's disease, as products of a global economy which the governments had lost control of.
His brother brought up to him the danger of mad cow's disease. He suddenly saw this as this another part of his apocalyptic world where mad cow's disease would break out because cows, as he pointed out, their hoofs were used in making all the gelatin caps on all the pharmaceutical products. So even if you were a vegetarian, you might wind up, and so he became very concerned with this.
But things didn't go the way Goldsmith feared. The global economy didn't collapse. In fact, within 18 months, it had bounced back. The boom started again, driven upwards by a frenzy of speculation around the world, and no one quite understood why. But it was an ideal time to do takeovers, and Goldsmith was tempted out of retirement to try for one last deal. In 1989, he returned to London to announce a bid for the giant British-American Tobacco Corporation. The old asset stripper was going to do what he had done so many times before: break it up, sell off large parts, and make himself a fortune. He called it liberating the company.
It is taking companies which are being stifled under the bureaucracy of a large conglomerate and liberating them.
The men whose support Goldsmith needed to succeed in his bid were the anonymous managers who ran the pension funds. But this time they refused to back him. The truth was that they were now so powerful they no longer needed people like him anymore. Over the past decade, the pension funds had grown enormously, and they now dominated the stock market. Through it, they owned over 70% of British industry. Their one and only aim was to increase the returns for their pensioners. In the past, they had always backed raiders like Goldsmith because they increased profits by sacking workers and selling off anything that didn't make a profit. But now, the pension funds had learnt they could do this themselves.
We showed to the pension funds you could increase the returns to pensioners. If you sacked 1,000 workers and you got rid of their salaries and wages from the profit and loss account, it would have a dramatic effect on the share price. Share price could go up 3 or 4 times, which is all the pension fund is interested in. And they did it for a purpose, which was to increase the income to the pensioners. And so the pension fund industry were the final arbiters. If they didn't like what you were doing, you wouldn't succeed.
The pension funds discovered they could asset strip companies themselves without the need for takeovers, because they already owned the majority of shares. And they now proceeded to do this throughout British industry on a vast scale. They closed factories and downsized thousands of workers. The resulting devastation was irrelevant to them, because the only thing that mattered for the pension funds was the increased return for the pensioners.
They went on because the only thing at the end of the day that mattered to a pension fund manager was the share price performance. I'm afraid the morality of what lay behind it was a consideration that certainly wasn't uppermost in his mind.
Do you blame the pension fund manager for that?
Not directly. I think it's an inevitable consequence of a free market, rather than to attribute specific blame to pension funds.
So the pension fund managers had also become trapped?
By the free market mechanism, yes. Yes.
So was anyone in control of this process by now?
No.
James Goldsmith went back to Mexico, defeated by a corporation that was more frightened of the pension funds than it was of him. In his anger, he now turned